Today, we are diving into an absolutely incredible story. It's about knowledge that was lost, a kind of intellectual relay race that crossed centuries and continents, and how it completely reshaped Western thought. And it all kicks off with one pretty provocative question. I mean, really think about that. What if the very foundations of so-called Western thought, the ideas that would eventually fuel the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, what if they were almost wiped from history? And what if they were only saved, studied, and then handed back by scholars from a completely different culture? It's a huge idea, and to get our heads around it, we have to start with the man at the center of it all. You guessed it, Aristotle. And this little comic strip here is actually pretty spot on. You've got these characters in the medieval Arab world asking, what's he reading so intently? And the answer? Aristotle. It's funny, but it points to a huge historical truth. Some of Aristotle's most dedicated readers were not in Europe. So the big question is, how did his work even get there? To figure that out, we have to start with how this knowledge was lost to the West in the first place. And it wasn't a single event. It was more like a slow intellectual fade to black. So, as the Western Roman Empire began to crumble, its intellectual centers just fell apart. A huge turning point was in 529 AD, when Emperor Justinian actually shut down the ancient philosophical schools in Athens. I mean, for centuries, these places had been the beating heart of Greek philosophy. When they closed, it was like a door slammed shut on an entire era. And in the chaos, so many original manuscripts were just lost, some destroyed, and many more simply forgotten in Europe. But here's the amazing part. As that door was closing in the West, another one was opening. The flame of Greek philosophy didn't actually go out, it just traveled east. Okay, this timeline maps out a truly epic journey. As the Arab world expanded into places like Syria and Egypt, they didn't just conquer, they encountered this incredibly rich Greek or Hellenic heritage, and it sparked something amazing: the Great Translation Movement. For 2 centuries, scholars worked like crazy translating all this Greek philosophy and science into Arabic. It wasn't until the 12th century that these texts, now loaded with brilliant new commentary, started to trickle back into Europe, this time translated from Arabic into Latin. And you have to understand, this whole process was messy. It was like a giant game of telephone spanning hundreds of years, full of mistakes and detective work. I mean, get this story about the theologian Algazel. He wrote a book to completely tear down the philosopher Avicenna's ideas. Part 1 laid out Avicenna's philosophy, and Part 2 demolished it. But for centuries, only the first part made it to Europe. So of course, everyone thought Algazel was Avicenna's biggest fan. It just goes to show you how fragile this whole rediscovery really was. And that brings us to the first of our intellectual heavyweights, a man known in the West as Avicenna. See, he wasn't just saving old knowledge, he was building something new on top of it. Avicenna, born in Persia, was a real force of nature, a true polymath. He was a world-famous doctor, his medical books were standard texts for centuries, a political advisor, and a philosopher who was just obsessed with Aristotle. But he didn't just want to be a student. He wanted to take Aristotle's ideas and push them even further. Okay, at the heart of his philosophy is this really elegant, powerful idea that would shape Western theology for centuries to come. Avicenna said there are basically 2 kinds of being. First, there's the necessary being. That's God. For God, existence isn't just something he has, it's what he is. It's his very essence. God can't not exist. But then there's everything else. You, me, the stars, we're all possible beings. We could exist, or we could not exist. Our existence isn't a given. We're contingent. We need an outside cause, that necessary being, to pull us out of just being a possibility and into actual reality. Now, in philosophy, no big idea goes unchallenged. Not everyone agreed with Avicenna's take, and that leads us right to our next major thinker, Averroes, who was on a mission to find a more pure, a more rigorous reading of Aristotle. Born in Cordoba, in what was then Arab-ruled Spain, Averroes basically dedicated his entire life to Aristotle. He wrote commentaries on just about everything Aristotle ever wrote, and his work was so detailed, so influential, that in Europe, he became known simply as the commentator. You didn't even have to say his name. If you were a medieval scholar reading Aristotle, you were definitely reading Averroes right alongside him. And right here is where he threw down the gauntlet. He directly challenged Avicenna's big idea, kicking off a debate that would rage in European universities. For Averroes, you couldn't separate a thing's essence, what it is, from its existence. He argued that existence isn't some extra feature, some accident that gets added to an essence. No, For Averroes, to be a horse is to exist as a horse. They're part of the same package. He believed this was much closer to what Aristotle actually meant, and he was trying to strip away all the other interpretations. And this strict commitment to philosophical logic led him to some pretty radical places. Following Aristotle's reasoning to its ultimate conclusion, Averroes argued that the world wasn't created at a single point in time from nothing. He argued it has always existed, that it's eternal. Now, this flew in the face of the creation stories of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. It was a hugely controversial idea, but for Averroes, it was the only logical conclusion. A really bold move that forced theologians everywhere to grapple with the limits of their own reason. And that incredible intellectual melting pot of Cordoba produced yet another giant, Moses Maimonides. He was wrestling with these exact same questions, but from a Jewish perspective. Maimonides was also a brilliant physician and philosopher, and he could feel this rising tension between religious faith and the undeniable power of Greek logic. And he knew that for a lot of smart, devout people, this wasn't some abstract academic debate. It was causing a deep, personal, spiritual crisis. So he wrote his masterpiece, The Guide for the Perplexed, for this very specific group of people. The perplexed were those who were deeply educated in the Torah, but who had also studied philosophy and science. And they felt completely torn. How do you reconcile the literal stories of Scripture with the cold, hard reason of Aristotle? Maimonides' whole goal was to build a bridge, to show them that these two paths could, in fact, lead to the same ultimate truth. And with these incredible thinkers, the stage was finally set. The knowledge that had started in Greece, that was nurtured and debated in the Islamic world, was now ready to complete its long journey home. The circle was about to close. This right here sums up the whole incredible story. It really was an intellectual relay race across 1,000 years. The baton of knowledge was passed from the Greeks to Arab translators. Then philosophical giants like Avicenna and Averroes took that baton and ran with it, adding their own powerful ideas. And finally, that baton was passed back to Europe through Latin translations, where it landed in the hands of people like Thomas Aquinas, igniting the fire of scholasticism and helping build the intellectual world we know today. When you step back, this whole story shows us that knowledge doesn't belong to any one culture. It's a shared human heritage. It flows across borders, across languages, across religions, and it leaves us with a really important question to think about. In our own hyper-connected world today, what vital ideas, what lost knowledge is just sitting out there, waiting for us to find it? Not by looking inward, but by looking across the cultural bridges that connect us all.